We need unity now more than ever, and I'm not quite sure that our political leaders are bringing that unification. It's quite sad, actually. So I think that this platform could transcend some of that.
That is Mike Solon, the president of the Seattle Police Officers Guild and now fellow podcaster, as he works to change the narrative, as he puts it, with the SPOG contract set to expire in just a few weeks' time. We're going to talk about that contract, including a new maneuver by the mayor and council as those negotiations begin. We're going to talk about participatory budgeting, and we're going to answer some great questions coming in from our listeners, too. Welcome back, my friends, to the show that never ends. It's Seattle News, Views, and Brews. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm also a host on Seattle Channel. The views expressed here are my own. My co-host, he put the wonk back in wonky. It's Kevin Schofield from Seattle City Council Insight. Hello, Kevin.
Hey, Brian.
All right, here we go, man. A shout out to City Grind Espresso, the background noise sponsor for the audio podcast. That, of course, the coffee stand on the first floor of City Hall. Closed during the pandemic. Please support them at their Henry Art Gallery location. Help out other small businesses too, folks. And some big thanks to our patrons on Patreon. We have a new patron, I should say. Jim, he just jumped on board. Thank you very much, sir. And Anthony, a current patron who raised his monthly giving level this week. Why can't you be more like Anthony, everybody? That's what I'm talking about here. Please join them, folks, and support independent local journalism. Very important to us, and I know it's important to you if you're listening. Just a few bucks a month really helps us keep things running here. Check out Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon. And finally, a big thanks to Converge Media for airing the video version of this podcast Wednesday nights at 6. Let's get going with Right Here, Right Now. So here we are, the first full week of December, and it's post-budget time. So the city of Seattle is just going to kick back, relax, put up its feet. Not even close. The council and mayor are gearing up for some contract talks with the Police Officers Guild, which covers the bulk of the rank and file officers within the SPD. And this week, in the council's Public Safety Committee, they're going to be talking about a new ordinance to strengthen the subpoena power of the Office of the Inspector General and the Office of Police Accountability. These are Seattle's civilian-led police oversight groups. They investigate police misconduct, too. This would put a finer point on how the OPA and OIG can subpoena civilians, compel their testimony, while also making sure those people subpoenaed understand their right to due process and to avoid self-incrimination. A lot of details to get through here, folks. But basically, as it stands right now, the OPA and the OIG already have the power to subpoena officers for their investigations. But I want to talk about the whole why behind this to start, Kevin, before we get into how this clashes with the contract here. Why are the council and mayor pursuing this plan to strengthen these subpoena powers?
Well, I think part of it is, this is one of the aspects of the 2017 police accountability legislation that never fully got implemented before.
Right.
And part of that was, it was an outstanding issue in contract negotiations for
Right.
a SPOG contract a year later. And at the end of the day, they couldn't resolve it, and the city agreed to just not implement it for the time being. But now that contract is about to expire in about 3 weeks, and they've got to go through, as you mentioned, a whole new round of negotiations. So I think they're kind of setting this up to go forward again. So, there are, a couple little, almost technical things that they need to fix in there. But then there's, a larger portion they wanted to add, as you also mentioned, about making sure that people who are subpoenaed and turn over information or, testify as part of that, understand their rights to, against self-incrimination on this, and that, any evidence that they turn over can't be used against them unless the police get a separate search warrant to get that information for any, investigation and prosecution.
Right. I guess at the end of this, even if and when the council does pass this legislation, and I think this might take a little while here, even let's say the council does pass this, it's still going to have to be negotiated with SPOG, right? Because the way that SPOG contract is set up, the SPOG contract, as it stands now, basically has precedence over what this legislation has done. Help us out with that part, please.
Yeah, so there's actually two big hurdles you have to get over. One is the SPOG contract, right?
Yep.
And in fact, one of the technical changes they made to this is they make it explicit that this, it needs to be negotiated with SPOG, and it's subject to collective bargaining. But the other part is that because this essentially modifies part of the police accountability legislation, which is still pending in front of Judge Robart in the consent decree, it actually has to go back in front of the judge again.
Yeah.
Right. And that is the part that's probably going to take longer, even than the SPOG contract part, because Judge Robart is holding it up basically already because the city has not. In fact, that's one of the big areas why Judge Robart found the city to be out of compliance with the consent decree around police accountability.
That's right.
Because he didn't like some of the things that the SPOG contract unrolled in the police accountability legislation.
Right.
So he's not going to be anxious to approve this, knowing that the same concern that he had before, that hey, I don't understand what this means until the SPOG contract is renegotiated.
Yeah.
Still holds true.
Yeah.
Right. So they're going to have to go negotiate the contract. They're going to have to take it in front of the judge again, and then we'll see how that plays out. So
and I guess
this is going to be quite a while.
I was going to say on this, I know we're talking about a deadline for the SPOG contract coming up at the end of this year, but it's clear from the last contract, I mean, that was almost 4 years old when the council actually renewed it in 2018 here. So I guess I'm trying to figure out the timing here, Kevin. As much as I'm looking at the end of the year and it's like, oh, there's our deadline there, that could certainly, the SPOG could stay with that contract well into next year. Do you see this taking months possibly as we kind of emerge from COVID? That's a piece of it too, and try to engage all these different players?
Yeah, so they're going to go back to the table in early 2021. How long it takes and whether they actually come to resolution on the contract, is anybody's guess.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Like you said, it took 4 years last time to get there. There was a point in there about kind of halfway through that 4-year period where the city and the union actually agreed on the contract, and then the police officers union members voted on it and they rejected it.
Right.
It was like back to the drawing board again. Okay, now what do we do?
Yeah.
Right?
And I think too, just to jump in briefly, at the start of this year, before COVID hit, there was a lot of progress being made on the consent decree. They were very close to a process where they thought at least they'd get a number of these things taken care of. Then the summer happens and all the George Floyd protests, et cetera. So a lot of different concerns milling around here too.
Yeah, it wasn't true. It wasn't clear that they were making progress in the police accountability stuff.
That piece was still sticking,
pretty much everything else.
Yeah.
But now some of those areas and pretty much everything else around crowd control and around use of force policies, those are back on the table again with a consent decree, because clearly there were issues in the police's ability to actually sustain the improvements they made in those areas, and stay consistent with their own policy.
Yeah. One last piece on this. What do you make of the fact that the mayor really does seem to be working together with the council on this? I know we reported a couple of months ago, just this whole process that the council is going to have more of a seat at the table when it comes to these negotiations. What do you make of that, seeing the mayor and the council trying to be united, at least in this front, to work on these negotiations together? Some thoughts about that?
Well, yeah. So I think, in this particular case, there is no doubt that the city council and the mayor are on the same page, that the SPOG contract is a big problem.
Yeah.
Right. And they have been angling for the last few months to try to build political capital and political consensus around negotiating hard with SPOG.
Yeah.
Right. Which is, really a very different position than they were in the last time they tried to negotiate.
No longer part of the Labor Council in King County.
Not part of the Labor Council. SPOG is really standing alone a lot more than before. They're really, kind of out there on their own. They've lost a lot of political capital over the last year.
Yeah. Yeah. We're gonna have to see how this all works out. So a lot still ahead with that one. We're going to keep tracking that. I did want to talk about another few things on the council's docket this week. There's a lot of stuff actually authorizing that 0.15% sales tax to be used for the Seattle Transportation Benefit District, voting on that, pushing it out. Whole bunch of committee appointments getting pushed through too. But tucked away in the Governance and Education Committee this week, an ordinance in the works to expand lobbying requirements for grassroots organizations. So a little background on this one. This is something brought forward by the Seattle Ethics and Elections Committee. They actually had this in the works in December of last year, but I'm thinking the impact of COVID, multiple budget processes here in 2020 basically pushed this to where we are right now. So this bill would require grassroots lobbying campaigns to register with SEEC, aligning city law with state law, a little bit more on that issue. Right now, no reporting required if the campaign does not include the direct lobbying of decision makers. So if people spend money on a big social media campaign, let's say, or pay for signs and banners, it's not considered lobbying right now. So that activity is rather hidden away. The council is talking about daylighting this activity, basically. What do you make of this, Kevin?
Yeah, so one part is the city just has an ongoing effort to try to keep its laws consistent with state laws, and this is a
Right.
place where a lot of there's one aspect of this we just like, okay, more work we just have to do to stay consistent.
Yeah.
But then there's another part here, which is the quote unquote grassroots lobbying stuff has really expanded a lot over the last 2 years. There's a lot of organized, and there's always been some organized groups that show up at City Hall in their T-shirts and arrange ahead of time to all show up and sign up for public comment session.
Right.
And that has certainly continued, including through the last year where it's all gone virtual. But there's really a couple different camps of organizations that do that. One is organized political groups that can do that, and they can kind of fly on the radar doing this. The other is wealthy neighborhood organizations who
Downtown Seattle Associates is one I think of.
And that's sort of in the wealthy business organization.
Okay, fair enough. That's fair.
But that's a fair one too. But also wealthy, like
Are you thinking up in Magnolia there, Kevin?
Yeah, Magnolia, and some of the other kind of wealthier neighborhoods.
Yeah.
So, if they get a little NIMBYism going, they can
The safe streets, that kind of a thing.
Right. But then, and this is something that's weighed heavily in the council, and I think it's one of the reasons why they haven't really pushed hard on this before. There are, less wealthy, community organizations that want to be able to have their voice heard, and and this is a little bit of a puzzle for this.
Yes.
How do you do enough to make sure that there's transparency about, these grassroots
Who's
groups
lobbying?
and, which ones are really grassroots and which ones are, astroturf.
But don't block them out. I mean, that's the other piece.
But
of this,
don't create hurdles that are large enough that you prevent neighborhood groups from being able to have their voice heard, right? So, in this case, they want them to register, but they're not imposing a registration fee.
Right. That's an important part. Hopefully that doesn't create a barrier.
And that's how they're trying to, sort of hit the right balance with this. They want transparency. They want everyone to know, okay, who are the organizations that are doing this? When like 50 people all, show up and read off the same script on this, who organized that?
Yeah.
But not stop them from doing it.
Right. Right. It's going to be really interesting to see how this plays out, not only because of that piece there, but because also with this, the fiscal note on this legislation and looking at this, it's going to take a lot of work on behalf of the city to try to make this happen. Maybe even some extra hires is what the Ethics and Elections Commission is saying, to the tune of at least $150,000. There's no money set aside for that right now. So that's a piece of this. And I just wonder how this plays into what's going to be a very active, potentially political year in terms of lobbying and campaigning as the mayor tries to potentially look at re-election, maybe other people in that mix. Where do you see this playing out in 2021, Kevin?
Well, and this comes up in a lot of things, where a lot of areas that the city, puts in new ordinances. You can pass the ordinance, and then there's a question of, okay, now who enforces it, right? And this probably at the very least will start out as a place, given the the budget restrictions in the city right now, where they pass a new ordinance with restrictions and they expect sort of voluntary compliance, and nobody's out there really pushing hard for compliance on this. And then at some point, if the workload really does turn out to be a lot, then SEC will make a case for like, hey, no, we really actually need somebody to help us with enforcement.
Sure. And then what are the penalties, et cetera? There's a few different cans of worms with this. So we're going to keep an eye on that one. I'm going to move on right now to Now Hear This. This is the part of the show where we pluck a soundbite from the tree of political knowledge, take a big bite out of it, and start chewing. So last week, Mayor Jenny Durkan signed the $6.5 billion budget the council approved the week before. And while she noted that she and the council have had some differences, she also said they are working together. Let's listen.
As we approach the end of an undeniably very challenging year, I believe we've turned a corner and can make collaborative, data-driven decisions that advance our shared policy goals.
So, Kevin, hearing this turn the corner conversation here, we've talked about the mayor and council working on, as it stands now, competing ways to invest in BIPOC communities. And I want to focus in on this. The mayor has her Equitable Communities Initiative Task Force. The council is working on participatory budgeting, which includes the Black Brilliance Project. You did a deep dive on this on Seattle City Council Insight. I want to talk about it. What'd you find out?
Well, so there's issues to be kind of examined on both sides of this. So the mayor has this task force. It's largely been opaque. They at some point put up pretty light on detail agendas for the meetings they've been having. They don't really pre-announce them. The meetings aren't open to the public, and they haven't published any minutes or any of their meetings they've had so far. So it's like, well, what are these guys going to decide
what's going on?
How to allocate $30 million? And nobody knows what they're really doing. Right. So there's some issues on that side. And then on the Black Brilliance research side, I took a hard look at the contracts that are being written for this.
Yes.
Which are being run out of Councilmember Morales' office.
Right.
And that's a little unusual. Sort of the standard arrangement for something like this would be that somewhere in the executive branch, something under the mayor would be actually going in, getting the contract executed and then managing the contract going forward. So it's unusual on its own for the legislative branch to be doing, they might have a little, consulting contract here, but nothing like a $3 million big contract. Right.
Yeah, so, and council clearly wants to have control of this. Yeah. Keep going.
They clearly want control over this, and, and their normal role in this is oversight, right?
Yes.
They from, arm's length away, watch the executive branch and make sure they're doing the right stuff, right? So it raises these interesting questions about, well, who's really doing oversight if the oversight branch is the one managing this big contract, right? And so that's kind of a questionable thing. And just to kind of drill on that for a sec,
sure.
The city auditor's office, who normally would kind of look in on things that look a little unusual, like this, works for the legislative branch, right? And by their own policy, they consider it a conflict of interest to investigate anything that happens in the legislative branch. So they won't touch this. It would take either the county auditor or the state auditor to, take notice and decide that they need to go look at this, right? So a contract like this being run on the legislative branch is really not going to get a lot of oversight. So
I was going to say, which is not to say that the goals of this study or whatever else are anything bad. It's just the way it's being executed. You have some really good questions on. Keep going, please.
Yeah, and so when you look at the actual contract that's being written for $3 million here, first of all, the way they did it is a little fishy because under city law, it's actually city ordinance, any contract over $54,000 needs to be bid out. Right? And what the council did was they actually they used a loophole in there. There's an exception there that says we can just directly award a contract for to any 501c3 public benefit corporation, right? So I said, oh great, we're going to use that. Except that King County Equity now, the organization is not a 501c3. So they did something that is actually done fairly often for small community organizations. Often because they don't have the infrastructure to do the whole 501c3 and manage all the paperwork and everything, and it's called a fiscal agent. Right. They get a 501c3 organization to basically be the pass-through and do all the paperwork for this and manage it and make sure everything's on the up and up. Right. So, but you get in this interesting situation now where they said, oh, right, we're going to use the exception where we don't have to bid out a $3 million contract because we're giving it to 501c3, but we're not really giving it to a 501c3. We're giving it to a fiscal agent on top of that. Right. And so that all looks, kind of they've when you get to the point where you're exploiting two loopholes in order to do the thing you want to do, you really have to ask, okay, is this really the right thing to do? And then when you actually look at the contract itself, it's not a very good contract. There is very little detail in the contract about what actual work is going to be done.
And the way the research is going to be done. I know you had some questions about that.
And how the money is going to be spent. There's no detail in the contract about how the money is going to be spent. And, and the first deliverable was do a project plan. And normally the project plan is actually, attached as a scope of work in the contract. But they said, no, it's going to be the first deliverable instead. And you look at the first deliverable and there's a little more detail in that, but there's still no detail about how any of the money is going to be spent. Right. So, it's not a good contract, right?
Well, you're comparing it to things we've seen in the past, soda tax, whatever else. There's been some really detailed plans like that.
Detailed plans for far less money, right? The multi-year soda tax research project is $150,000, right? So that's, this contract is 20 times larger than
right.
that, right?
Right.
And the soda tax one had a detailed budget of how all the money was going to be spent, and it had a detailed scope of work that said, here's all the steps and who's going to do all the work and all this, right? And so, you know, this was just not well done. This was not well done. And, you know, we can hope everything comes out great. We can hope they do great work and they find out, you know, important insights. But you know, this is just not the way these things are supposed to be done. And for, you know, what's a large amount of money, right? And
$3 million isn't pocket change.
To say, you know, we're okay with this. It's just,
Yeah. It's something I know Councilmember Morales is bullish on. We're going to stick with this story, Kevin, and I know we're going to track it into the next year, but I wanted to make sure I touched on another note from last week here. A U.S. District Court magistrate said some landlords, they were seeking this injunction on the eviction moratoria, plural, from the state and city of Seattle. The judge said these eviction bans were constitutional, so he rejected that injunction. It seemed like the judge's basic idea was here, and this is a nationwide problem we're talking about here with an eviction moratorium. If we make more people homeless, the judge says, they're more likely to get COVID. So there's a legitimate public interest in that. I just wanted to throw that at you, Kevin, because that sounded like really what the judge was trying to get across here.
Yeah. So, you know, the context of this ruling was this wasn't a final ruling.
Okay.
This was the plaintiffs asking for a preliminary injunction.
Right.
Which is like super early in this whole process.
Yep.
And the rules for a preliminary injunction are like, okay, there are these 4 tests that you have to hit in order to do that, right? You need to show that you're likely to succeed on the merits of your argument. You need to show that you're going to suffer irreparable damage if the injunction isn't awarded. You have to show that the balance of the equities, meaning, you know, how much is it going to harm, you know, the defendants if you get an injunction versus how much it harms you if you don't get an injunction.
Right.
Tips in your favor. And then that it's in the public interest. So they have to prove all 4 of those things.
Right.
The judge said, you know, I'm not sure, you know, you haven't shown very clearly that you're going to, you know, succeed on the merits of this. In fact, there's a lot of weaknesses in your argument. You know, and a lot of the you haven't shown that there's irreparable damage because all you said is basically, you know, it's economic damage and law and lots of case law. You know, economic damage, you know, can be dealt with by, you know, awarding money.
Sure. Right.
So that's not irreparable. Right? That's very repairable. Right.
Yep.
And then, you know, in terms of looking at kind of how the equities tip in the public interest with the COVID pandemic and with homelessness, you know, it sure looks like it tips in favor of the governments and not private landlords. And, you know, he did wrap up by saying, look, you know, I understand this is causing real pain for landlords. Right.
And the courtroom might not be the best place to handle this.
And the courtroom is probably not the best place to do this, right? This really needs to be legislators going and figuring out the right thing to do.
Yeah. All right. Well, a lot more on that story ahead. Actually, I'm working on a story on Seattle Channel this week about the eviction moratoria, hearing from renters, landlords. Make sure you check it out on City Inside Out. Let's move on to our final segment. What's next? Okay, so for our final segment here, we put out the call for questions to our patrons this week, and we got a ton of them from Rob. Rob, thank you so much for asking all these different questions. We're going to do what we can today. We're answering your question about police funding in West Seattle with a special patrons-only podcast. So patrons out there, if you want to be a patron, make sure you do that. We'll make sure we answer your questions as best we can. But there are a few questions we can tackle today. So Rob asks this, Kevin. How did Kevin become SCC Insight? I'm pretty sure I got this one. You were bitten by a radioactive spider. You developed some superpowers. That's kind of the right track, right?
Yeah. You know, maybe a radioactive bookworm or something.
I see. What's the backstory? What do you got?
Oh my. So about 6 years ago, I left my corporate job, and you know, writing had always been like in different ways a part of my job over you know, a few decades, but it had never been the job. And so you know, I wanted to say, look, let me like really be a writer. And you know, I started taking some classes, and you know, in the meantime, you know, I've been doing some volunteering in the community for a long time. And one of the issues that was related to an organization I was volunteering with in the community came up in front of the city council.
Right.
So in early 2015,
Yeah.
For about 8 to 10 weeks in a row, I was going to city council meetings every Monday, speaking in the public comment session and sort of representing.
Yeah.
And I kind of got hooked on city council meetings.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
There are a lot of people who go to public comment, go to the city council meeting, speak at public comment, and immediately leave. And I and a handful of other people just
stuck around
and watched the rest of the meeting and listened. And and they were really struggling with some hard and interesting policy issues at the time. And I just kind of get hooked. So, as the summer kind of went on, I just kept following city council meetings. But then, coming back to the writing part on this, when you're getting into writing, one of the things, a piece of advice that's super, super true is you have to find a reason to write every day.
Yeah.
Right.
Boy, that's very true.
Some kind of prompt or something that just, you can buy apps that just will give you a random prompt every day to go write something on this.
Yeah.
If you're not writing every day, you're not building up the muscles and the skills to be able to do this. So I was kicking around in the fall of 2015, looking for okay, what's the thing that's just going to get me writing every day? And I realized that there was one staring me in the face. And I looked around and nobody else was there's obviously lots of city hall reporters.
Yeah, but nothing as council specific.
Nobody was really focusing on the legislative branch of the city. And I said, oh, okay, all right. So, I set up a website and it became my daily writing prompt. It's like, I'm going to write today about what they're doing. And it just kind of slowly took on a life of its own.
No, it has. And I certainly appreciate all the work you do. And I know Rob does that too. So you've revolutionized the game in terms of city council coverage, Kevin. I appreciate that.
I wouldn't go that far.
All right. You started some good stuff, that's for sure. Rob also had another question I wanted to throw out there. Can I be the show's intern? Rob, man, I wish we could make that work, because in between the typing that Kevin does and I does, someone needs to do some of this typing for us. I'm just going to throw that out there. Short answer is I have no idea how to do that in the remote setting we are in, but I appreciate the sentiment very much. And man, I wish I could take you up on that somehow. I want to finish up the podcast, if we could, with a look at the proper treats to have on your coffee break. Kevin is the star baker. I'm the star eater in this scenario here most often. Kevin, I have a buttercream frosted chocolate cupcake from my daughter here. Okay. Now check this out. So I'm going to let you in on a little secret what the kids are doing these days. So what you do is you cut that cupcake right through there. Okay. Cut it right in half, kind of widthwise there. Then you put this guy on top. Check it out. Cupcake sandwich.
Oh, I see what the kids are doing now.
That just happened, man. So
you don't lick. They're not licking all the frosting off the top.
No, it's cupcake sandwiches these days, or at least my kids, who I
said,
can't vouch for their parenting. They make some interesting choices. But yeah, I got to say, cupcake sandwiches has kind of revolutionized this game, which cupcake eating, we need more of that in our household.
Yeah, well, everybody needs more cupcake eating.
This is true. This is true.
Yeah.
Good stuff all around. Well, Kevin, I thank you once again for watching me eat cupcakes, for one, and for all the great insights on what's happening with the Seattle City Council.
Yeah, and next time your daughter makes cupcakes, we'll save a couple minutes here. I'll give you kind of the rundown on how to make really great cupcakes from a box mix that are indistinguishable from scratch. Because
now
this
that's
is something
what I'm talking about.
I made cupcakes once a week, and at my corporate job for the last few years that I was there. So I got really good at making cupcakes.
Okay. This is how we get people to tune in next week. So Kevin, this is awesome.
Next week? Okay.
I can't wait for it. I can't wait. Thank you so much, sir, for joining me here. And the next time you want to know what's happening in local politics, folks, give us a listen here on Seattle News, Views, and Brews. Find out what's brewing. You can subscribe on iTunes or Spotify, wherever you listen. And please do support us on Patreon. If you like what you're hearing, we need your help to keep this thing going. Thank you so much, and thanks for watching on Converge Media 2. We will see you next time. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2020.